We've talked so far about a project structure where we have an app directory, which is our Meteor app, and then other folders like a configuration directory for configuration, and then any additional files that are not directly Meteor related but are related to our project, like, for example, a README. In the rest of this video, I'd like to talk about an actual application structure that we might use with a real application instead of this simple one that gets created by default. Meteor doesn't have a very strong opinion about how your application should be structured, but there are some rules. So I'll cover those and I'll give you an example application structure that works well for me. And then you can decide for yourself what you think makes sense for your project. Our Meteor application goes through a build process where Meteor processes these files for us. And the first consideration of how to organize our application is what code and resources we want available on the client versus the server. Let's take an example. Let's say that we have a JavaScript file or some JavaScript code, and we want that code to be available only on the server. So in other words, we don't want to send it down to the browser so that users can see it in the JavaScript console. In other cases, we might only want to send the JavaScript to the client and keep it off of the server because there's nothing we can do with it there. And in many cases, we want the code to be available in both places. So the first thing we'll do in our application structure is create folders for each of these locations. I created 3 new folders, and I opened up a terminal window on the right so that we can add some files in a minute. So I created a folder called both, and as you may have guessed, we'll put files that we want to go onto the browser and the server, and we'll put those in this folder. And then similarly, in the client folder, we'll put all the things that we want to go on the client only, and things that we only want on the server, we'll put in the server folder. Now, this works because Meteor processes the client and server folders specially, so it knows that anything inside of the client folder should only go in the client, and same for the server. The both folder is something that we just made up and to make the organization a little bit nicer. But Meteor will, by default, take any JavaScript or HTML files and make them available in both places. Now, a quick note before we move on file load order. So far we have these 3 high-level folders that are mostly for organization. And next we want to take a look at load order, and that's the order in which Meteor loads and executes these files. Now, within each one of these directories, what Meteor is going to do is first start off at the deepest level of the folder hierarchy. So for example, if we have a lib directory and then something under that, say child, Meteor will go all the way into the child folder and process the files there, and then process the files here, and so on. And for each one of these levels, Meteor will process the files in alphabetical order. So we're taking advantage of this fact, and that's why our both folder here works. Let's start off in the both folder, and we'll create some files and folders that we want available on both the client and the server. Now, typically in all of these folders, I'll have an app.js file, and that will be for overall application level JavaScript. Next up, in the both folder, I'm going to create another folder called Views. The Views folder is where we'll put our templates and any JavaScript and less or style sheets associated with that template. It's just an organizing principle or a way of organizing the app. Now, as of this video, there's no server-side rendering of templates or even using of templates. And so it doesn't quite make sense to have this views in the both folder. But that functionality should be coming decently soon, and so I'm going to go ahead and create the views folder in each one of these client, server, and both, so that you can get a feel for it. Now, inside of the views folder, we can go ahead and create views, and what I typically do is for each view, it has its own folder. And so if you have a template, you would create a folder for that template, and inside of the folder put the HTML, JavaScript, and any other resources like style sheets. So let's pretend we have a view called to-do index. So I went ahead and created a new folder called to-dos underscore index. This would be for a template that has our list of to-dos. And if you expand into that folder, I also created the files that are required for this template. So it has an HTML file, a JavaScript, and CSS. Inside of the HTML file is where I'll define the template. And so you can see the template has a name here, and I tend to use all caps or capital case for the naming of the templates because they're actually, you can think of as like a class instead of an instance, and so I use capital letters for it. To-dos index. And then inside of that template, sometimes you might want to create an enclosing div that has a class so that we can style this particular template in a very specific way. Then over in the CSS file, I have a to-dos index class for this div. And then finally over in the JavaScript, we have the to-dos index helpers and to-do index events. Inside of here, you may only have the template file, and you might choose to skip the CSS file or to put those all in one place at the application level, and that's fine. And if you don't have any JavaScript associated with the template, you don't really need to create this JavaScript file. But generally, I have one created anyway, just in case we want to put some helpers or events on the template. Another thing you can do is to nest these folders. So for example, if you have an overall view called to-dos, you might have a parent folder and then nest all the different to-dos related views under that. Next up, let's create a folder for our collections and really anything to do with data. So to do that, I'll use the make directory command, and we'll make a folder called collections. You might also call this folder models. Inside of the collections folder, we'll add a file for each collection in our application. And we'll define the collections that we want to exist on both the client and the server in the both folder. So let's say we have a collection called to-dos. So I'll create a new to-dos collection called to-dos.js. And inside of that, I'll create a global variable called to-dos and assign it to a new Meteor collection. So this will make this collection available on the client and on the server. Next up in this file, I'm going to create a section for our queries that we want to be available on the client and the server. This can be useful to organize all of the queries in one place around the to-dos collection itself. For example, let's say that we want to have a query that returns a cursor of all the items in the list. To do that, I'll define a method called find and then all. And normally I prefix all of these methods with find if it returns a cursor. And that helps myself and other users of these methods know that this should return a cursor. And in this case, it'll return a cursor for all the items in the collection. So if you have additional methods like find recent, you can just keep adding functions to the collection itself. And that just keeps things nice and organized. Next up, if you have any methods, these are Meteor RPC methods that you want to run in both the client and the server, you can define them here. And so any methods that are associated with the to-dos collection, I'll put in this file so that they're easy to find. So you can use whatever naming scheme you want here, but keep in mind that Meteor uses this kind of naming scheme here. So you'll have to do something that is a little different than that. For example, you could get rid of this /. And if you have a custom method, you could name it something like this. And all of those can go right here. And remember, since these methods are being defined on the client and on the server, we're going to have to differentiate by using if meteor.isClient. Or we could say, for example, if this.isSimulation. And this would be the logic that gets executed on the client. And this would be on the server. As your application gets really large, you might find that you want to separate out methods into a separate folder. But I find that it's nice to have all this stuff in one place since it's all related to the to-dos collection. So these queries and methods will be available on both the client and the server. And next, what we want to do is to focus on things that will only be on the server. So namely, we'll look at security and publish functions. To do that, over in the server folder, I created another folder called collections, just like we had in both. And inside of that, I have another file called todos.js, and that's where we'll put only the code that we want on the server. So the first part here is the security for the collection. So this is where we have our allow and deny rules, and we only want that on the server. And the second down here are the publish functions. We can only publish things on the server, so it makes sense to put these in the server collections file. And notice that inside of the publish functions, we're calling the query methods that we defined earlier on our to-dos collection. I've gone ahead and duplicated this structure for each of our both client and server folders. And so if we wanted to put any kind of logic for this collection or even to create a collection that's client only, we could put that here. Next up, if you're using Iron Router, you'll likely be creating route controllers. And I typically put those inside of a folder called controllers. So I can go ahead and create another folder in both called controllers. And for each one of the route controllers, I just have a file for that particular controller. For example, I might have one for the to-dos index controller. Inside the controllers folder, I created a new to-dos index controller file, and inside of it is the definition for the to-dos index controller with its action function. Now, you might have controllers that should be in both the client and the server, but once again, if you only have one that you want on the client, we can put it here, and if there's only one for server-side routes, we can put that in a controllers folder on the server. Now for the actual routes, you can go ahead and put those in the app.js file. So you can see I have a group here called routes, and here's our route defined for the to-dos path. Now with Iron Router, most of the time, you'll want your routes defined on both the client and the server so that the server knows about the client routes and doesn't throw a 404 saying it can't find the route. But in some cases, you might want routes that only exist on the server and you don't want the browser to know about it. And in that case, it's perfectly fine to define the route inside of this app.js down here. That way it won't get sent down to the client and the client won't know about it. Next up, I've created two new folders here, one called packages and the other called public. The public folder is where you'll put public assets like your favicon, and you can nest as many folders in here as you'd like. And the packages folder is where we're going to put local packages that are specific to our application. Now, typically, packages that are local to the application like this are for a couple of reasons. One would be if we want to have some logic that we reuse all around our application, but we're really not sure where to put that stuff, so organization. The second would be if file load order is really important for some functionality on the site. And the third would be if we're overtaking a core package and we want to override it. So this will be the first place that Meteor looks for packages, and so we can go ahead and override packages by just symlinking or copying them right into this directory. Now for applications or for packages that are application specific, I like to namespace them with the new Meteor packaging system with something like app or the name of your application. Now over time, we should have tools that make developing these structures a little bit easier, like M. But I wanted to build this up by hand so that you can see the thinking process behind a more sophisticated application structure.